Some people believe God opens doors with miracles. Others believe he opens them with people. On the coldest night of Nathan Cole's life, he chose both. Snow drifted across the abandoned train depot outside Ashwood Ridge, covering the cracked platform in a blanket of white that seemed to swallow every sound. The old station had been empty for years, forgotten by nearly everyone except the wind that still wandered through its broken rafters. Nathan pulled his worn canvas jacket tighter as he walked beside Shadow, the 6-year-old German shepherd who had become his closest friend through years of hardship and long roads. The temperature had dropped below 20 degrees, and the air carried the sharp scent of pine, ice, and distant wood smoke. Shadow suddenly stopped. His ears lifted high. Every muscle in his body became still. Nathan knew that posture. The dog had sensed something. Then came 3 slow knocks. Knock, knock, knock. The sound echoed from somewhere inside the dark station. Shadow stepped forward without hesitation. Nathan followed, boots crunching softly over frozen gravel. The depot felt strangely alive despite its emptiness. Moonlight slipped through shattered windows, painting silver lines across the floor. Then, near an old waiting bench, he saw her. A blind woman sat alone in the darkness, her hands folded calmly around a wooden cane, as if she had been waiting for someone all along. Before Nathan could speak, she turned toward him and smiled. "Nathan," she said softly, "I was beginning to wonder when God would send you." For a long moment, Nathan simply stood there, unable to answer. Snow whispered against the broken windows, and the old station seemed to hold its breath around them. The woman remained seated on the weathered bench, her pale hands resting lightly on the curved handle of her cane. She appeared calm, almost peaceful, as though being alone in an abandoned depot on a winter night was the most natural thing in the world. Shadow moved first. The German shepherd approached slowly, his paws silent against the dusty floorboards. His amber eyes never left her face. Nathan expected caution. Instead, the dog lowered his head and gently pressed his nose against her hand. A smile touched her lips. "There you are," she whispered. "I knew you would find me first." Nathan felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold. "Ma'am," he said carefully, "how do you know my name?" The woman tilted her head toward the sound of his voice. "Because I have been waiting for you, Nathan Cole." The answer only deepened the mystery. He had never seen her before. He was certain of it. Ashwood Ridge was hundreds of miles from the places he had wandered during the past few years. Yet there was no uncertainty in her voice. She spoke his name the way an old friend might. Outside, the wind shifted, sending a soft moan through the rafters overhead. The woman slowly rose to her feet. Though blind, she moved with surprising confidence. "My name is Margaret Bell," she said. "Would you be kind enough to walk me home?" Nathan hesitated. Questions crowded his mind. But one look at Shadow settled the matter. The dog stood beside Margaret as if he had already accepted her. Together they stepped back into the snowy night. The road wound along the edge of a frozen lake where moonlight shimmered across the ice like scattered silver. The air smelled of pine sap and distant fireplaces. Margaret walked between Nathan and Shadow, one hand resting lightly on the dog's shoulders whenever the path narrowed. She seemed to know exactly where she was going. Nearly a mile later, they reached a hill overlooking the water. At the top stood an old Victorian house surrounded by bare maple trees. Warm yellow light glowed behind a handful of windows. The house looked ancient yet cared for, as if time itself respected the place enough to tread softly. Nathan noticed something unusual immediately. Along the front porch were 7 identical doors, each painted deep blue and marked with a small brass number. 1 through 7. The sight felt strangely deliberate. Shadow stopped walking. His ears lifted, his gaze fixed on the final door at the far end of the porch. Door number 7. A low sound rumbled in his chest. Not fear. Not warning. Recognition. Margaret seemed to sense it. Her smile widened faintly. "Yes," she said quietly. "He sees it too." Nathan stared at her. "Sees what?" The old woman turned her face toward the winter sky, where stars glittered above the frozen lake. "The door that has been waiting for you." The following morning arrived wrapped in silver light. Frost clung to the porch railings, and the frozen lake below the hill reflected the pale winter sky like polished glass. Nathan woke before sunrise in a small guest room Margaret had offered him. For a few moments he forgot where he was. Then he heard the faint creak of old floorboards and smelled fresh coffee drifting through the house. Shadow was already awake. The German shepherd sat near the window, staring toward the porch with unusual focus. Nathan followed the dog's gaze. Even from inside, he could see the row of 7 blue doors stretching along the front of the house. And once again, Shadow's attention remained fixed on the 7th. Downstairs, Margaret stood in the kitchen humming softly to herself. The room felt warm and timeless. Copper pans hung above an old cast-iron stove. Morning sunlight spilled across worn oak counters polished by decades of use. Despite her blindness, she moved with effortless confidence, measuring coffee grounds and arranging breakfast plates as though guided by an invisible map. "Good morning, Nathan," she said before he spoke a word. "Did you sleep well?" Nathan paused. "How did you know I was here?" Margaret smiled. "The house tells me." The answer sounded playful, yet something about her tone suggested she meant it. During breakfast, Nathan learned little more. Whenever he asked questions about the doors, Margaret gently changed the subject. She asked about his travels, his years after military service, and the long roads that had brought him through countless towns. She listened carefully, never interrupting. It felt less like a conversation and more like someone reading pages from a book she already knew by heart. By afternoon, clouds gathered over the lake. Nathan offered to help around the property. Several fence posts had loosened after an early winter storm. The porch steps needed repairs. Margaret accepted his help without hesitation, as though she had expected the offer all along. Hours passed beneath a gray sky. The air smelled of cedar and approaching snow. Shadow followed Nathan everywhere except when they passed the 7th door. Each time, the dog slowed. Each time, he stopped and stared. At sunset, something unusual happened. Nathan carried a bundle of firewood across the porch when Shadow suddenly froze. The dog's ears lifted sharply. A low whine escaped his throat. Nathan turned toward the row of doors. The first 6 remained still. But beneath the 7th, he noticed a thin line of golden light shining through the gap under the threshold. He set down the firewood and stepped closer. The light vanished instantly. The door looked exactly as it had before. Old blue paint. Brass number 7. Nothing more. Yet his pulse quickened. Shadow pressed his nose against the wood and released 3 quiet breaths. Behind them, the front door opened. Margaret stood in the fading light, holding a lantern. Her expression seemed both peaceful and sad. "Not yet," she said softly. Nathan looked at her in confusion. "What is behind this door?" For several seconds, only the wind answered. Then Margaret lifted her face toward the darkening sky. Snowflakes had begun drifting from the clouds above the lake. "A promise," she whispered. "And promises only open when the right season arrives." Winter settled over Ashwood Ridge with the quiet patience of falling snow. Days turned into weeks, and somehow Nathan remained at the house above the frozen lake. What began as a single night of shelter became a rhythm neither he nor Margaret ever discussed. Each morning arrived with the scent of coffee and cedar smoke. Each evening ended with the soft glow of lantern light reflected against old windows. Nathan repaired loose shutters, strengthened fences, and cleared snow from the winding path that led down toward the shoreline. The work felt honest, familiar. For the first time in years, he woke with somewhere to be. Margaret never asked him to stay. Yet every gesture seemed to say he already belonged. Shadow settled into the routine as naturally as if he had lived there his entire life. He followed Margaret through the house, resting near her chair while she read Braille. Books beside the fireplace or listened to records that crackled softly with songs from another era. Yet one thing never changed. Whenever he crossed the front porch, his attention drifted toward the 7th door. The first 6 doors opened normally. One held gardening tools. Another led to a storage room. One opened onto a small library scented with aging paper and pine shelves. But the 7th remained locked. Always locked. One afternoon a storm rolled across the lake, covering the sky in layers of gray. Snow drifted sideways through the wind. Nathan worked inside the barn securing loose boards while Shadow rested nearby. Suddenly the dog lifted his head. His ears stood alert. Without warning, he hurried toward the house. Nathan followed. By the time they reached the porch, Shadow was already standing before the 7th door. A low whine escaped his throat. Nathan noticed something strange. Hanging beside the frame was a brass wind chime. During every storm since his arrival, it had remained silent. Now it moved gently despite the still air beneath the covered porch. One clear note rang out. Then another. Soft, delicate, almost musical. Nathan touched the locked handle. The metal felt unexpectedly warm. Behind the door came a faint sound. Not a voice. Not movement. More like the distant turning of pages. The sensation lasted only seconds before disappearing completely. The wind chime fell silent. The porch returned to stillness. Behind him, the front door opened. Margaret stepped outside wrapped in a dark wool sweater. Snowflakes settled across her silver hair. She seemed unsurprised by what she found. "You heard it too," she said quietly. Nathan turned. "What is behind this door?" Margaret remained silent for several moments. Her sightless eyes faced the frozen lake below as though she were listening to something far away. Finally she smiled. There was warmth in the expression, but also sorrow. "My husband used to say every life is given one sacred assignment," she whispered. "Most people spend years searching for it. Some never find it at all." The wind shifted across the hillside. Below them, the lake shimmered beneath the storm clouds like a sheet of silver glass. Shadow remained seated before the door, watchful and patient. Margaret reached down and gently rested her hand on the dog's head. "When the time comes," she said softly, "he will know before either of us." February arrived beneath a sky the color of pearl, and the frozen lake stretched to the horizon like a sheet of quiet glass. The world around the hill seemed suspended between seasons, waiting for something unseen to awaken. Nathan noticed changes in Margaret long before she spoke of them. She moved more slowly through the house. Sometimes she paused in the middle of a sentence as though listening to a distant voice carried on the wind. Yet her spirit remained bright. Each evening she sat beside the fireplace, a knitted blanket across her lap, sharing stories about the man she had loved for more than 50 years. His name had been Samuel Bell. He was a carpenter by trade, but Margaret always described him as a builder of hope. Samuel believed every person was given a reason for being here, she said one evening while snow drifted softly beyond the windows. Not a job, not a title, a purpose. Nathan sat quietly nearby, polishing an old lantern he had repaired earlier that day. Shadow rested on the rug between them, his ears occasionally twitching toward the distant sound of wind moving across the lake. "Did he find his purpose?" Nathan asked. Margaret smiled toward the firelight. "He spent his whole life trying." The flames crackled softly. Shadows danced across the walls lined with photographs and memories. "Before he passed, he told me something I never forgot. He said there would come a day when a weary traveler and a faithful dog would arrive at this house. He said they would carry wounds no one could see, and when they came, the waiting would finally end." Nathan felt the room grow strangely still. The old clock in the hallway continued its steady ticking, yet everything else seemed to fade into silence. "That sounds like a prophecy," he said with a faint smile. Margaret laughed gently. Samuel would have called it faith. Outside, a sudden gust swept across the porch. The brass wind chime beside the seventh door rang once. Clear, pure, delicate as crystal. Shadow immediately lifted his head, his amber eyes fixed toward the front hallway. Nathan noticed the change at once. The dog rose slowly and walked toward the porch entrance. Margaret turned her head slightly. "Go see," she whispered. Nathan opened the front door. Cold air drifted inside, carrying the scent of pine and snow. The porch stood empty beneath the evening sky. The first 6 doors remained dark and ordinary. But beneath the 7th, a thin ribbon of golden light glowed once more, brighter than before. Shadow approached and sat directly in front of it. The dog did not bark. He simply stared. Nathan knelt beside him. As his hand touched the wooden floorboards, he felt a faint vibration. Gentle, rhythmic, almost like the steady beating of a distant heart. Then it stopped. The light vanished. The porch returned to darkness. Behind him, Margaret spoke softly from the doorway. "The season is changing." Nathan turned. The old woman stood framed by warm lantern light. For the first time since he had met her, there was moisture shining in the corners of her eyes. "And some doors," she whispered, "only open when it is time to say goodbye." March arrived with warmer winds drifting across the lake, carrying the scent of thawing earth and wet pine. The ice that had covered the shoreline all winter began to retreat, revealing dark water that shimmered beneath the afternoon sun. Yet as the world outside slowly awakened, Margaret seemed to grow quieter with each passing day. Nathan noticed it in the small things. The way she lingered beside the fireplace after conversations ended. The way her fingers rested longer on the spines of old books. The way she sometimes sat on the porch facing the lake, listening to the wind as though it were telling her a story only she could hear. One evening a gentle rain moved across the hillside. Drops tapped softly against the windows while fog drifted over the water below. Nathan prepared dinner in the kitchen while Shadow rested near Margaret's chair. The house felt unusually peaceful, almost sacred. Margaret smiled as she listened to the rain. "Samuel loved nights like this," she said quietly. "He used to say, rain was heaven's way of reminding us that every season eventually changes." Nathan carried a bowl of soup to the table and sat across from her. "You talk about him like he was here yesterday." Her smile deepened. "Some people never really leave." For a while neither spoke. The rain continued its soft rhythm against the roof. Then Shadow suddenly lifted his head. His ears rose. Every muscle in his body became alert. Nathan felt it too. Something had shifted inside the house. Not danger, not fear, just a strange stillness that seemed to settle over every room at once. Shadow stood and walked toward the front hallway. His nails clicked softly against the wooden floor. Nathan followed. At the end of the hall, the seventh door stood exactly as it always had. Yet tonight the brass wind chime beside it moved gently, though every window in the house was closed. One clear note rang through the silence. Then another. Then a third. Shadow sat before the door and released 3 soft barks. Not loud. Not urgent. A greeting. Nathan felt a chill travel through him. When he turned back, Margaret was standing at the end of the hallway. Her face seemed peaceful, lighter than he had ever seen it. In her hands, she held a small wooden box. "I think it is time," she whispered. Slowly she walked toward him and placed the box into his hands. Inside rested an old brass key attached to a faded blue ribbon. The metal looked worn smooth by decades of careful keeping. Nathan stared at it in silence. "Margaret," she gently touched his shoulder. "Do not be afraid when the door opens." Tears glistened in her sightless eyes. Some endings are only beginnings wearing different clothes. Later that night the rain faded. The clouds parted. Moonlight spilled across the lake and into the quiet house. Nathan woke before dawn to find Shadow sitting beside Margaret's chair. The dog remained perfectly still, his head lowered. A soft smile rested on Margaret's face as though she had fallen asleep listening to something beautiful carried on the wind. The first rays of morning sunlight touched the windows, and somewhere in the front hallway, a single chime rang clear and bright through the silence. The days that followed moved with the quiet solemnity of a church bell carried across distant hills. Spring sunlight gradually replaced the gray skies of winter, and the lake below the house shimmered beneath gentle breezes that smelled of cedar and fresh earth. Friends from the small town gathered to honor Margaret's life. They spoke of her kindness, her patience, and the way she always seemed to know exactly what someone needed before they asked. Nathan listened from beneath an old maple tree, Shadow seated faithfully beside him. Though the voices around him were warm, a deep emptiness lingered inside his chest. The house no longer felt quite the same. Its rooms remained filled with light, yet something precious had departed with the woman who had somehow known his name before they ever met. Several evenings later, after the last visitors had gone and silence returned to the hilltop, Nathan found himself standing once more before the seventh door. The brass key hung from the faded blue ribbon exactly where he had left it. Moonlight streamed through the hallway windows, painting silver patterns across the wooden floor. Shadow approached and sat beside him. The German shepherd's ears stood alert. His amber eyes remained fixed on the lock. For a long moment neither moved. Then a familiar sound drifted through the house. The brass wind chime rang once. Clear, gentle, certain. Nathan's pulse quickened. He looked toward the porch. Every window was closed. No wind stirred outside. Yet the chime rang again. Shadow stood immediately. This time the dog released 3 soft barks. The same 3 barks Nathan had heard on the night everything began. Slowly he reached for the key. The brass felt warm against his palm. As he inserted it into the lock, a strange feeling settled over him. Not fear. Not excitement. Something deeper. A sense that unseen pieces of his life had been moving toward this moment long before he ever arrived in Ashwood Ridge. The lock turned smoothly. A soft click echoed through the hallway. For several seconds nothing happened. Then the door slowly opened inward. Nathan expected a room, perhaps an office, a workshop, maybe a hidden collection of Samuel Bell's belongings. Instead, he saw a narrow staircase descending into darkness beneath the house. Cool air drifted upward, carrying the scent of old wood, paper, and cedar. Shadow immediately stepped forward. His tail remained still. His posture was calm and confident. Nathan picked up a lantern from a nearby table and followed. The staircase curved downward farther than he expected. At the bottom stood another door made of polished oak. Unlike the blue door above, this one stood slightly open. Warm golden light spilled through the gap. Nathan pushed it wider. The sight beyond stole his breath. Shelves stretched across the enormous underground chamber. Thousands of carefully organized files filled the room. Maps covered one wall. Framed photographs covered another. At the center stood a large wooden table beneath a hanging lantern. Resting on the table was a single envelope. Across the front, written in elegant handwriting, were 5 simple words. For Nathan Cole, at last arrived. Shadow quietly placed his paws beside the table and looked up at him. Somewhere deep within the hidden chamber, a clock began to chime the hour, and Nathan realized the greatest secret of the house had never been treasure. It had been waiting for him all along. With trembling hands, Nathan lifted the envelope from the table. The paper felt old but carefully preserved, as though someone had expected it to survive many years waiting in the darkness below the house. Shadow sat quietly beside him, watching. Encountered hundreds of forgotten people. Elderly widows living alone. Veterans struggling to rebuild their lives. Families facing hardships with nowhere to turn. Samuel believed that kindness should never depend on luck. He believed every person deserved someone willing to open a door when life seemed determined to close every one of them. Nathan looked around the chamber again. Suddenly the shelves made sense. Each file represented a life. Each photograph represented a story. Some folders contained letters from people who had received help. Others contained records of small properties, trust accounts, donations, and community projects quietly established over many years. Samuel and Margaret had spent half a century building a network of hope hidden beneath the ordinary surface of everyday life. Shadow stood and walked toward one wall covered in framed photographs. Nathan followed. There were hundreds of faces. Farmers, teachers, veterans, grandparents, children, ordinary people smiling beside homes, workshops, gardens, and community centers. Beneath each photograph was a small brass plaque describing how their lives had changed after receiving help from the Bell Foundation. Nathan had never heard of such an organization. That was exactly the point. Samuel had written about that too. Real kindness does not seek applause. It seeks results. Window high above. Golden lights spilled across the room, illuminating the map, the photographs, and the countless stories waiting to continue. For the first time in many years, Nathan felt something awaken deep within him. Not certainty, not comfort, something stronger. Purpose. The years that followed unfolded like sunlight spreading across a long winter landscape. Spring returned to Ashwood Ridge, then summer, then autumn painted the hills in gold and crimson before snow once again covered the lake. Yet the house above the water never felt lonely again. Under Nathan's care, the mission Samuel and Margaret had spent decades building began to grow in ways he never imagined. The hidden chamber beneath the 7th door became the heart of something larger than any one person. Letters arrived from across the country. Veterans searching for a second chance. Elderly men and women facing life alone. Families carrying burdens too heavy to bear by themselves. Nathan read every letter. He answered every one. Some requests needed a place to stay. Others needed tools, training, transportation, or simply someone willing to listen. Through it all, Shadow remained beside him. Visitors often noticed the dog first. Somehow he always seemed to know exactly who needed comfort. He would sit quietly beside a grieving widow, walk beside a nervous veteran attending his first support meeting, rest near frightened children until their smiles returned. People began calling him the guardian of Bell House. Nathan never argued. One crisp October morning, nearly 3 years after opening the 7th door, Nathan stood on the porch overlooking the lake. The air smelled of pine and fallen leaves. Sunlight shimmered across the water. Behind him, laughter drifted from the house. A retired teacher was helping children with reading lessons in the library. Two veterans were repairing benches near the shoreline. A widow from Montana was tending flowers in the garden Margaret once loved. Life filled every corner of the property. The mission had become a family. Shadow sat beside the seventh door, older now, a touch of silver appearing around his muzzle. His amber eyes remained bright. The dog suddenly lifted his head. The brass wind chime moved gently. One clear note rang through the autumn air. Nathan smiled. He walked to the door and rested his hand against the weathered blue paint. Time had softened its surface, but the feeling remained the same. It was no longer a symbol of mystery. It had become a reminder that the most important doors in life are rarely the ones we search for. They are the ones that appear when kindness leads us somewhere we never planned to go. As the sun lowered toward the horizon, golden light spread across the lake like liquid fire. Nathan looked toward the distant water and thought of the blind woman who had known his name before he spoke it. He thought of Samuel's faith, Margaret's patience, Shadow's unwavering loyalty. Then he looked at the people gathering on the lawn below, sharing stories, laughter, and hope. The journey had never been about inheritance. It had never been about secrets hidden beneath a house. It had been about discovering that purpose often arrives disguised as a simple act of kindness. The wind drifted across the hillside, carrying the scent of cedar and the promise of another season. Shadow rested his head against Nathan's leg. Together they watched the last light settle over the lake. And for the first time in many years, Nathan understood exactly where he belonged.